So there's this massive paradigm shift. There's these very clear signals that are maybe more clear than they've ever been. And yet we still are in this sort of status quo compliance 2.0 type situation where folks are still reporting to GCs. They don't have that true unleashed, power. They still, have arguably some potential compromises to their independence. So what's going to change it? If I can just pause real quick as you dial in that answer. 10 years from now, we're not going to be having this conversation. 10 years from now, a lot of this is already going to be taken care of. I think our challenge as next gen ethics and compliance professionals is to condense that time. How do we make the future that would otherwise be 10 years from now? How do we make that be our reality 3 years from now, 5 years from now? So what do we start to do then to accelerate that for our own program or for our own career?
So I'm gonna disagree with you just a little bit on it's gonna be fixed in 10 years. I've been talking about this for 15 years and it still hasn't been fixed, right? I see it all the time where there's the compliance officer who's reporting to somebody they probably shouldn't have. And I think that's really a functionality of exactly the topic that you brought up. How do we move from a compliance officer to a compliance executive? And the number one reason that I know and that I see that the compliance officer, the compliance official, we'll call them, hasn't moved to that next level is because of distrust within the CEO and the board of directors. And distrust not meaning distrust like, hey, I don't think you're a truthful person or I don't think you're an ethical person. I think from a business standpoint, they look at it and say, I don't know what you'll do. Like you have the ability to reach the highest levels of this organization if I put you in this position. And I don't know if you're going to send my board off spinning out of control because you've told them a bunch of things that really aren't a risk to the organization, but for some reason in your mind that you have thought that, right? We go back to the DOJ evaluation of compliance officers, it's experience, it's expertise, it's knowledge, it's all those other things you got to evaluate. So they're very scared of having the compliance officer have this direct access to CEOs, this direct access to the boards, which could just say, hey, by the way, I'm going to report whatever I want to because I am the compliance officer and spin them out of control, which means that it can create dollars, it can create disasters, it can create exposures. And a lot of that is because of distrust. They fall back to general counsels because they trust their general counsel. They're like, hey, you went to law school. Hey, you're a fiduciary. Hey, you've got a law license. Hey, I can throw you underneath the bus if I need to with legal malpractice or whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, they rely on their general counsels as an individual who is like trustworthy to the organization because they're lawyers. Either way, it doesn't defend the independence that needs to happen with the compliance officer and the CEO, but building that compliance executive is the thing that we haven't done over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's really unfortunate. We need to start doing that. And maybe that means that everybody's not a compliance officer. Maybe that means that not everybody's going to be reporting to the boards or to the CEOs. But either way, we need to elevate this position to where it should be, as opposed to just taking it on as a moniker of saying, hey, by the way, I'm going to do this because you have designated me as a compliance officer. You got to work for it. You got to be an executive.
Yeah, and I think so. There's so much in what you just said. That paragraph or that answer could be its own podcast or its own, webinar in and of itself. But I think you touched on a really important point that many times is lost on us. I think a lot of us live in this sort of conditional tense, meaning the tense of should. Well, I should have this power. I should have this independence. I should have the ability to drive whatever change forward and so forth. But Ross, to your point, that should kind of is like a non-factor. What is what is, and that trust thing is a massive deal. And I think what it boils down to from an executive perspective is, do you, before I entrust you with a bunch of power to potentially spin the board off in this or spin off middle managers doing that, am I convinced that you are looking at the world in the right way, my way, right? I mean, that's the fact of it, right? I'm not saying that every executive is necessarily looking at it in the right way, but they hold the keys of power that you need in order to really elevate and be independent. You need to, it's a game of persuasion, to your point, to build that kind of trust, to show them that you are looking at, you're running at least a similar algorithm with a similar sort of hierarchy of priorities across what matters most to the business. Not just rules for rules' sake, but rules in the context of the risks that are actually in play for our business or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of criteria that I always start off with what makes a good compliance officer, right? One, and I tell this to all the compliance officers that I consult with, I coach with, I mastermind with, to try to get them to this level of being a compliance executive, is one, do you know your business? Period. End of story. If you don't know the business that you're working in and you just think your world surrounds this little compliance world, then you're not going to ever be a compliance executive. You have to know what it means. You have to know how it operates. You have to talk to the operators. You have to talk to revenue cycle. You have to talk to the CFO. You have to understand it right off the bat. If you don't, you have no ability you should be able to operate the company at the end of the day, right? Because you know so much about this company and the ins and the outs of it. That's how a compliance executive starts. Secondly, you got to know the regulations. I'm sorry, but you got to know them in and out, and you have to be able to interpret them and understand what they say. Just because it's the black letter of the law and it says X, Y, and Z, there's a lot of enforcement actions. There's a lot of interpretations. There's a lot of ways of doing things that says, how am I going to make this work within our organization that actually can protect them, right? But still allow them to grow and still allow them to be successful. And that's really what we need to do. Those are the kind of the two basic steps that I always tell compliance executives. That's where you need, compliance officers who want to get to that next level and want to be a strategic partner, who want the CEO sitting beside them going, we're doing strategic planning today. And by the way, I want you standing right next to me in case someone comes up with a harebrained idea. I can turn to you and go, hey, Ross, what do you think about that? Can we get there? And I go, maybe not that way, but I think there might be a way that you can do this, but you're kind of buttoned up against the guardrails. So those are kind of the 2 to 3 different ideas that we first have to establish in getting to be a compliance executive and winning that trust of both the CEOs and the boards.